The grand hall of the Veterans Lodge hummed with a peculiar energy, a resonant chord struck from decades of shared histories, some glorious, some grievously borne. Flags of the nation and its military branches hung like silent sentinels from the high rafters, their colors deep and rich beneath the warm glow of chandeliers. It was the annual reunion of the 17th Infantry Division Association, and the air thrummed with hearty greetings, booming laughter, and the clinking of glasses, a symphony of remembrance and rekindled camaraderie. Arthur Pendleton moved through the periphery of this vibrant scene, a ghost in his own quiet way. At 78, his movements were deliberate, each step measured, a map of old aches and resilient sinews. His janitor's uniform, a soft gray that seemed to absorb the light, was impeccably clean, but bore the gentle wear of countless shifts. He wasn't invisible by choice, but by the nature of his role, a silent steward of the spaces where others celebrated. He had seen many such gatherings in his years at the lodge, each one a fresh tide of memories washing over the polished floors he tended. He paused by the buffet table, his eyes, the color of a winter sky, noting a nearly empty tray of shrimp cocktail. With a nod, almost to himself, he made a mental note to alert the kitchen staff. As he turned, he saw an elderly gentleman, distinguished by a row of miniature medals on his civilian jacket, reach for a glass of water. The man's hand trembled, a tremor that spoke of age or perhaps old wounds, and the glass tipped, sending a cascade of ice and water onto the crisp white tablecloth and a portion of the floor. A flush rose on the veteran's cheeks. Before a server could even notice, Arthur was there. He moved with a quiet efficiency that was almost graceful. He placed a reassuring hand gently on the man's forearm. "No trouble at all, sir," Arthur murmured, his voice soft, a low baritone that rarely rose above a conversational tone. He produced a clean cloth from his cart as if by magic, swiftly dealing with the spill on the table, then another for the floor. He retrieved a fresh glass, filled it with water from a nearby pitcher, and placed it firmly in the older man's hand. "There you are." He offered a small, almost imperceptible smile, then discreetly fetched a fresh napkin for the man's dampened jacket sleeve. The veteran, flustered but grateful, managed a shaky, "Thank you. Very kind." Arthur simply nodded and moved on, melting back into the background, the small act of kindness, a ripple unseen by the larger currents of the room. He continued his rounds, emptying bins filled with discarded cocktail napkins and paper plates, his gaze lingering for a moment on the faces around him. He recognized the cadence of soldiers' talk, the easy profanity, the shared jokes that needed no explanation. A part of him, long dormant, resonated with it, a faint echo from a lifetime ago. He straightened a slightly askew photograph on the wall, a black and white image of young men in fatigues, their faces hopeful and shadowed by the uncertainties of war. He did not polish the brass fittings of the honor roll plaque. He tended to them, as if buffing away the tarnish of forgetfulness, keeping the names bright for those who remembered, and for those who never knew. His work was a quiet ritual, a form of respect. He believed that places, like people, held memories, and it was his duty to ensure this particular place remained worthy of the echoes it contained. He was not bitter about his station in life. He had made his peace with the world's often careless ways. He found a certain solace in the order he created, a small measure of control in a life that had known profound chaos. Near the bar, a knot of men, younger than most in the room, perhaps in their late 50s or early 60s, had gathered. Their laughter was louder, their suits sharper, their confidence blooming with the self-assurance of careers that had peaked in peacetime or in the modern, more technological military. They were men who likely commanded conference rooms now, not companies in the field. Arthur passed by, his cart gliding almost silently. One of them, a man with a neatly trimmed goatee and a voice that carried, gestured dismissively with his drink. "Look at that old fella," he said, his tone laced with an amusement that bordered on contempt. "Still hanging around the military, even if it's just to push a broom. Some guys just can't let go." Another chuckled, a short, sharp sound. "Probably tells his grandkids he stormed Normandy, eh? Ends up cleaning spills at reunions. Sad, really." A third, leaner man with restless eyes, added, "Hey, Pops," he called out, though not loud enough for Arthur to be obligated to respond. "Need a hand with that trash? Wouldn't want you to strain yourself." The jest was met with appreciative snickers from his companions. Arthur heard them. Of course, he heard them. The words, meant to be casual barbs, landed with the dull thud of familiar dismissals. A muscle twitched almost imperceptibly in his jaw, the only outward sign of his internal reaction. He paused for a fraction of a second, his hand tightening on the handle of his cart, then continued his slow, methodical progress. He didn't turn, didn't acknowledge them. What was there to say? Their words were not about him, not really. They were about their own perceptions, their own unthinking ease. He had faced far worse than the careless cruelty of comfortable men. He'd endured the infernos of combat, the screams of the wounded, the chilling silence of the dead. A few ignorant remarks were but whispers in the gale of what he had already weathered. Inside, though, a familiar ache settled. Not anger, not anymore. It was a profound weariness, a sorrow for the forgetting, for how easily the substance of a man could be overlooked, reduced to the uniform he currently wore. He remembered a time when the uniform meant something different, when the measure of a man was not in his rank or his current station, but in his courage, his integrity, his willingness to stand for something larger than himself. He pushed his cart towards the service corridor, the laughter of the group fading behind him, replaced by the quiet hum of the building's utilities. He sighed, a breath held too long, and let it go. The world kept turning, and there was still work to be done. He focused on that, on the tangible tasks at hand, a balm against the sting of casual disdain. He had his dignity, a fortress built from experiences they could not imagine, and it needed no defense against such petty assaults. The lodge's main hall was reaching the zenith of its convivial clamor when a subtle shift began to ripple through the crowd. Conversations near the entranceway quieted, heads turned, and a path seemed to spontaneously clear. The master of ceremonies, a retired colonel with a booming voice, tapped the microphone, the sound momentarily hushing the room further. "Gentlemen," the colonel announced, his voice resonating with pride, "it is my distinct honor to introduce our guest of honor this evening, a man who has not only served this nation with unparalleled distinction, but continues to inspire us all. Please welcome General Marcus Harrington." A wave of applause, genuine and respectful, swept through the hall. General Harrington entered, and even without the announcement, he would have commanded attention. He was a tall man, his posture erect despite the silver at his temples. His uniform was adorned with an array of ribbons and stars that spoke of a long and storied career, each one a chapter in a life dedicated to service. Yet, there was nothing ostentatious about his presence. His eyes, a clear, intelligent blue, held a warmth that tempered the inherent authority of his rank. He moved with an easy grace, shaking hands, offering sincere smiles, his gaze connecting with those he greeted. Arthur, who had just returned from the kitchen after ensuring the buffet was replenished, stood near a side exit, his cart positioned unobtrusively. He watched the general's arrival with a detached interest. He had seen many high-ranking officers in his time, men of power and influence. They were part of the tapestry of the military world, figures he observed from the quiet corners he inhabited. He held no particular awe for rank itself, only for the character of the man who wore it. General Harrington made his way towards the head table, pausing occasionally to exchange a word with an old comrade or a new acquaintance. The group of men who had earlier mocked Arthur were now standing straighter, their expressions eager, hoping for a nod or a moment of the general's attention. Their earlier dismissiveness was replaced by an almost fawning respect for the uniform and the stars it carried. As the general neared the center of the room, his gaze, which had been methodically scanning the attendees, suddenly stopped. It fixed on a point across the expanse of tables and milling veterans, towards the shadowed alcove where Arthur stood. For a moment, the general's polite smile faltered, replaced by an expression of intense focus, then dawning recognition. He changed direction, his aides and the welcoming committee momentarily nonplussed as he veered from the expected path. He moved with a purpose that cut through the remaining chatter, drawing curious glances. The group near the bar watched, puzzled, as the four-star general made a direct line, not towards any dignitary or recognized figure, but towards the old janitor by the service door. Arthur, sensing the shift in trajectory, looked up, a slight frown creasing his brow. He assumed the general needed something, perhaps directions to a restroom or a query about the facilities. He prepared to offer his assistance, his professional demeanor firmly in place. General Harrington came to a halt directly in front of Arthur Pendleton. The two men stood in stark contrast. The general, resplendent in his decorated uniform, a figure of national importance. Arthur, in his simple gray work clothes, a man accustomed to the shadows. A hush fell over the immediate vicinity. Those closest strained to hear, their curiosity piqued by this unexpected diversion. The general looked at Arthur, his blue eyes searching the older man's weathered face, a face he had not seen in nearly half a century, yet one that was seared into his memory. A flicker of disbelief, then certainty, crossed the general's features. "Arthur," he said, his voice, usually so commanding, now softer, tinged with something akin to awe. "Arthur Pendleton? Is that truly you?" Arthur, taken aback by the personal address from such an eminent figure, could only manage a slow, hesitant nod. His mind raced, trying to place the general, but time and trauma had clouded many faces from that distant, searing past. Before Arthur could formulate a proper response, before he could even fully process the moment, General Harrington did something that sent a collective gasp through the onlookers. He straightened to his full height, his shoulders squared, and in a voice clear and resonant, imbued with a respect that was profound and unmistakable, he said, "Sir, it is an honor to see you again." He then extended his hand, not for a casual shake, but with a deference that was palpable. Arthur, momentarily stunned into immobility, slowly reached out and took the offered hand. The general's grip was firm, conveying a depth of feeling that transcended the simple gesture. The group of men who had mocked Arthur now stood frozen, their earlier smirks wiped clean, replaced by expressions of utter bewilderment and a dawning, uncomfortable apprehension. The entire dynamic of the room had shifted, pivoted on that single deferential word, "Sir." General Harrington did not release Arthur's hand immediately. He turned slightly, addressing not just Arthur but the silent, watchful crowd that had gathered, his gaze sweeping over them before coming to rest pointedly on the astonished faces of the men near the bar. "Gentlemen," General Harrington began, his voice regaining its customary command, yet retaining that undercurrent of deep emotion. "Some of you may wonder why I address this man, Mr. Arthur Pendleton, with such profound respect. Let me tell you." He paused, ensuring he had everyone's complete attention. The silence in the hall was now absolute, heavy with anticipation. Arthur stood quietly, a little flushed, his eyes downcast, clearly uncomfortable with being the center of such attention. He looked like a man braced for an impact, though of what kind, he wasn't sure. "It was the spring of 1969, the general continued, his voice painting a vivid picture against the backdrop of the festive hall. "The Ashau Valley. Many of you here know that name, know what it meant." A few solemn nods rippled through the older veterans in the audience. "I was a young first lieutenant then, barely old enough to shave, leading a platoon into what can only be described as hell on earth. We were ambushed, pinned down. Casualties were heavy, immediate." The general's eyes seemed to look past the walls of the lodge, into a distant, smoke-filled landscape. Our aid station, little more than a collection of foxholes and hastily erected ponchos, was right on the line, taking direct mortar and machine gun fire. Our medics. God, our medics were heroes, every last one. But they were overwhelmed. Wounded men were everywhere. He turned his gaze back to Arthur, his voice softening with a raw memory. "I was hit, badly, shrapnel in my chest and leg. I was bleeding out. I knew it. I remember the chaos, the screaming, the smell of cordite and blood. I remember thinking, this is it, this is where it ends." The general took a deep breath, and then, through the smoke and the hellfire, came this man. He placed his other hand on Arthur's shoulder. He wasn't much older than I was then, but he moved with a calm, a purpose, that was extraordinary. This was Specialist Arthur Pendleton, our company medic. A murmur went through the crowd. A medic. One of the most revered and essential roles in combat. He was everywhere. General Harrington's voice grew stronger, filled with the vividness of a memory that time had not dimmed. Triaging under fire, dragging men to cover, his own helmet long gone, his fatigue soaked in the blood of others, and sometimes his own. He'd been grazed more than once but refused to stop. He had so little to work with. Bandages, morphine, sheer will. I saw him shield a wounded man with his own body when a mortar round landed terrifyingly close. I saw him talk quietly to a boy who was dying, holding his hand, offering comfort when there was no hope of saving him, ensuring he didn't die alone. The general's eyes locked onto Arthur's. He got to me. Others had passed me by, likely thinking I was too far gone. But he knelt beside me. I remember his hands, steady, surprisingly gentle. He found the worst of the bleeding in my chest, a severed artery. There was no time for fancy procedures, no surgical unit for miles. He packed the wound, applied direct, brutal pressure, talking to me the whole time, telling me I was going to make it, that I had to hang on. The general paused, his throat working. The room was so quiet, one could hear the faint hum of the ventilation system. He stayed with me, even as the fighting intensified around us, even when rounds were snapping inches above our heads. He kept that pressure on, kept me conscious, kept me alive, until a dust-off chopper could risk coming in. He personally carried me, and two others he'd also stabilized, to that chopper, still under fire. He made sure we were secure. Then, instead of getting on himself to safety, he turned and ran back into the fight, back to the other wounded. A collective intake of breath. "This man," General Harrington declared, his voice thick with emotion, his grip tightening on Arthur's arm, "is the reason I am standing before you today. He is the reason my wife has a husband, my children have a father, my grandchildren have a grandfather. He didn't just save my life, he saved the lives of at least a dozen other men that day, and countless more throughout his tour. He never sought medals, though he earned the Silver Star for his actions that day, and a host of others he probably never even collected. He never boasted. He just did his job, with a courage and a compassion that I have rarely seen equaled in all my years of service." The general finally released Arthur's arm, but kept his gaze fixed on him. He was, and is, one of the finest soldiers I have ever had the honor to know. A true hero. The word "sir" is not just a formality from me to him. It is a mark of the deepest respect one soldier can offer another. Arthur Pendleton stood very still, his weathered face a mask of humility, perhaps a touch of remembered pain flickering in his eyes. He swallowed, then finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear in the profound silence. "Just doing my duty, General, like you, like all of us who were there." He gave a small, almost apologetic shrug. We all looked out for each other. The silence that followed was different now. It was no longer the silence of anticipation, but of awe, of profound, humbled understanding. The men who had mocked Arthur moments before seemed to shrink. The one with the goatee stared at his own shoes, his face burning a dull red. The man who had called Arthur Pops looked physically ill, his earlier bravado utterly deflated. They had judged a book by its plain cover, and now its breathtaking contents had been laid bare. Slowly, as if awakening from a trance, an older veteran in the front row, his own chest adorned with medals from a bygone era, began to clap. It started as a solitary sound, then another joined, and another, until the entire hall erupted in a thunderous, sustained ovation. It wasn't the polite applause for a distinguished guest. It was a raw, emotional tribute, a wave of gratitude and respect washing over the unassuming janitor who stood quietly by the service door. Arthur looked overwhelmed, his gaze shifting from the general to the applauding crowd and back again, a faint blush rising on his own cheeks. He offered a small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement, his humility as evident now as his courage had been then. General Harrington placed a hand on Arthur's back, a gesture of solidarity and protection, as if shielding him from the sudden, overwhelming attention. The applause eventually subsided, leaving an altered atmosphere in its wake. The superficial bonhomie of the earlier gathering had deepened into something more meaningful, more reflective. Several veterans, some leaning on canes, others walking with the stiff gait of old injuries, made their way towards Arthur. They didn't crowd him, didn't seek to lionize him. They approached one by one to offer a quiet handshake, a soft-spoken "thank you, brother," or "God bless you, Doc." Each greeting was met with Arthur's gentle nod and a sincere, "good to see you." He deflected praise with an innate grace, turning compliments into shared acknowledgments of service. General Harrington drew Arthur slightly aside. "Arthur," he said, his voice low and earnest, "I've often wondered what became of you. After I was evacuated, I tried to find you, to thank you properly, but in the chaos of war," he trailed off, a hint of old regret in his eyes. "To find you here, like this, it's a gift." Arthur offered a rare, small smile. "Life takes its turns, General. I ended up here. It's quiet work, suits me. But you deserve more than quiet work in the shadows," the general insisted gently. "You deserve recognition." "I have all the recognition I need," Arthur said, his gaze sweeping briefly over the faces in the room, now looking at him with newfound respect. "Knowing I made a difference when it counted." That's enough. He paused. It's good to see you well, Lieutenant. I mean, General Harrington. The old address slipped out, a testament to the vividness of the memories resurrected. The general chuckled, a warm, genuine sound. You can call me Marcus, Arthur. After all you did for me, I think we're past formalities. He clasped Arthur's shoulder again. Stay, please, be my guest for the rest of the evening. Arthur hesitated, then nodded. All right, Marcus, for a little while. The formal program of the reunion continued, but the true keynote had already been delivered. Arthur sat at a table with General Harrington, not as a janitor, but as an honored comrade. The men who had belittled him kept their distance, their conversations muted, their eyes often straying towards Arthur with a mixture of shame and awe. The air was cleared of its earlier arrogance, replaced by a humility that resonated deeply. As the evening drew to a close and the attendees began to depart, Arthur quietly resumed some of his duties, collecting discarded programs, straightening chairs. It was habit, ingrained. He sought no further accolades. The quiet dignity he had always possessed now shone, visible to all. One of the men from the mocking group, the one with the goatee, approached him, his earlier confidence gone, his expression deeply chagrined. He stood awkwardly before Arthur for a moment, struggling for words. Mr. Pendleton, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to apologize. What we said earlier, it was inexcusable. We didn't know. I am truly sorry. He extended a hesitant hand. Thank you for your service, sir. The sir was no longer a joke, but a word freighted with newfound understanding. Arthur looked at the man, his gaze steady, without resentment. He took the offered hand briefly. Son, he said, his voice gentle, we all have our battles. Some on the field, some within. The important thing is to learn, to see beyond the surface. Remember that. Just remember that. The man nodded, visibly moved, then retreated, rejoining his companions who watched from a distance. Their lesson learned in the most public and humbling of ways. Later that night, long after the last guest had departed and the hall was silent and empty, Arthur completed his final rounds. The lodge was peaceful, the echoes of the evening settling into its wooden bones. He found a small, heavy object left discreetly on the worn wooden table in the tiny break room he used. A General's Challenge coin, intricately designed, bearing the insignia of General Harrington's command. It lay there, glinting softly under the dim light. Arthur picked it up, its weight cool and solid in his palm. It was a token of profound respect, a soldier's ultimate acknowledgement. He didn't go straight home. Instead, he drove to a small, community garden he tended on the outskirts of town, a place few knew was his sanctuary. The first pale light of dawn was just beginning to paint the eastern sky. He walked among the rows of sleeping plants, tomatoes, beans, sturdy sunflowers yet to turn their faces to the day. He knelt, his old knees protesting mildly, and gently touched the dark, rich soil. It was here, among the quiet promise of growth, that he often found his peace. He held the coin, its metallic certainty, a contrast to the soft earth. He thought of the young men whose lives he had touched, those he had saved, those he had mourned. He thought of Lieutenant Harrington, now a general, a man who had remembered, who had honored a debt of life across the vast expanse of years. The world could forget, it often did, but sometimes, in unexpected moments, it remembered. The sun finally crested the horizon, spilling gold and rose across the land. Arthur Pendleton, who had once mended the shattered bodies of men in the crucible of war, watched the light spread. He felt that familiar, quiet, stirring within him, not of past glories, but of present duty. He had a garden to tend, a small patch of earth to nurture, just as he had always tended to whatever task lay before him, with steadfastness and an unwavering heart. The coin was a reminder, yes, but his true reward lay in the earth itself, in the cycle of planting and harvest, in the enduring, quiet dignity of a life lived in service, seen or unseen. And as the new day broke, the land, like a memory properly honored, seemed to breathe with him, full of silent, resilient hope.